My topic is entitled, or my presentation is entitled, Climate Justice Now, Fridays for Future as a New Wave of Environmental Activism. As you might be aware, climate change is one of the greatest global crises of humanity and thus poses enormous challenges to society. Hence, the pressure to solve the climate crisis is constantly increasing. In this context, the emergence of Fridays for Future can be perceived as an expression of increased social dissatisfaction with climate crisis. The Fridays for Future climate movement started with the protest of Greta Thunberg in front of the Swedish parliament and grew to a global movement. Under the banner Fridays for Future, school children and students worldwide are mobilizing for climate justice. The Fridays for Future call for climate justice and an immediate action to ensure the maximum increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming in line with the Paris Agreement. The demands of Fridays for Future Austria further include the immediate ensuring of climate protection in the Constitution, the withdrawal from the extraction of oil, coal, and gas by 2030, and a continuous reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2030. Further concrete demands include the eco-social tax reforms, measures to promote biodiversity, and the termination of major infrastructure projects, such as the third runway at the international airport in Vienna. Never before so many young people were on the streets by using school strikes as one of the major protest forms. Public and political attention has been substantial in European countries, and Greta Thunberg became more or less the icon of the movement. A new generation has become political, representing a historical turn in climate activism. This wave of protest mobilization is exceptional in its tactics, in its socio-demographic composition, and also with regard to their political attitude. The presentation addresses the activism of Fridays for Future by analyzing the socio-demographic composition and the political attitudes of the Fridays for Future activists in Austria. In so doing, I will discuss the uniqueness of the youth activism and whether a generational conflict exists in the movement. A further focus of the presentation is on the political attitude of Fridays for Future. I will conclude with some reflection on how Fridays for Future activism changed during the pandemic. My research is situated in the studies of youth and environmental activism, and also in social movement studies. Therefore, I will reveal to academic debates on youth generational conflicts and social movement research. While most academic attention is on adult activism, and neither the field of youth studies nor social movement studies perceives young activism sufficiently, I will particularly focus on this aspect of youth activism. My presentation is based on a mixed method approach, including qualitative and quantitative data from climate strikes. Therefore, the data collection consists of 4 different surveys, which we conducted in the frame of an international research team, which uses the same questionnaire in order to understand Fridays for Future in Europe and beyond. On this slide, you see the different standpoints of Fridays for Future and the work and where the research has been conducted in September 2019. The design of the research follows the international study called Code in Action of Protest Contextualization Contestation Project. And the main idea of the international study is to use the same questionnaire and to compare different Fridays activism in Europe and beyond. On the slide, you can see the different fields where we conducted the research. And here you can see also who was part of the international team. In Vienna, we also conducted research independently from the international team in order to organize a data collection on Fridays for Future in the long term. And we also complement the survey by qualitative data collection. The qualitative data collection consists of short interviews, which we collected during the strikes, observational protocols and protest observation during the strikes, guiding interviews with experts and activists of Fridays for Future, a focus group discussion. I will today just refer to the data of the climate strike in September 2019, where Fridays for Future was able to mobilize around 30,000 participants. And I will quickly or briefly refer also to the climate strike in September 2020, which was organized during the pandemic. Fridays for Future was able to mobilize 6,000 people. And I will somehow also include some qualitative data, but for today, my focus will be on the quantitative data in order to present you the attitudes and the socio-demographic data of the Fridays for Future activists. Most of this data have been conducted in the frame of the Forschungswerkstatt Protest at the Department of Development Studies, and the voluntary assistance of many students made this important research possible. So I would like to thank all the assistant students who made our research possible. And I would also like to thank the University of Vienna and the AK Vienna for their support of the research. Why is Fridays for Future unique compared to previous environmental activism? Let us briefly look at the history of climate activism in Austria. Fridays for Future changed environmental activism. The Austrian environmental movement was strong in the 1970s and 80s, as you might know. During the transition from the industrial to the service society, the so-called new social movements emerged, among them the environmental, the student, or the women's movement. At that time, the potential danger of environmental pollution became increasingly obvious, as the oil crisis of the 1970s revealed the scarcity of resources and related consequences. At this time, environmental activism emerged and challenged political parties, which did not have any environmental policy at that time. Environmental activism was concerned about the expansion of energy industry, but also on air and water pollution, pesticides or rubbish and waste problems. There are two central peaks of mobilization at that time. The protest against the nuclear power station in Zwentendorf in the year 1976 and 1977, and in 1983 and 1984, the occupation of the Hainburger Au against the construction of the hydroelectric power station. These protests were one of the decisive factors in the founding of the Green Alternative Party, which first entered the National Council in 1986. Triggered by this protest, environmental protection was successfully ensured in politics, and also citizens got the opportunity to involve in political decision-making process. Environmental activism became one of the issues in politics and even in a broader public discourse. In the 1990s, the environmental activism changed because it became more professionalized and institutionalized. From that time up to the 21st century, environmental policy commitment has hardly expressed through protest, rather than non-governmental organizations such as Global 2000, Greenpeace, and many others. In 2015, a new movement with the slogan "System Change, not Climate Change" emerged and brought at least the protest back to the streets. They brought in new forms of lobbying, but they weren't able to mobilize masses for climate justice. Also, climate and environment are currently among those topics with the highest mobilization capacity in Austria. It was just the success of Fridays for Future who mobilized the masses. After decades of institutionalized lobbying for environmental politics, Fridays for Future brought the resistance and environmental struggles back to the streets. It was Fridays for Future which re-established mass demonstrations as a tool for environmental activism. And Fridays for Future also changed the framing of protests from environmental issues to climate justice as a demand. I wouldn't say that Fridays for Future was the most important or prominent actor who changed this framing, but at least Fridays for Future established the framing in the media and in the broader public. Fridays for Future is unique. First, because Fridays for Future managed to bring climate activism back to the streets, as already mentioned. Second, the movement was able to simplify the complex issue of climate change and climate justice, transform it from the sciences to the public, and creating personal connections. Fridays for Future contributed also, as already mentioned, to establish climate justice as an important frame for action. Third, the framing of the movement demands is shaped by a dramatic language referring to the threat of humanity and the future. Friday for Future is symbolically demonstrating the drastic nature of the climate crisis, with statements by Greta Thunberg such as, "I want you to panic." The need for fundamental change is pointed out, and the government is held accountable for climate policy. Fourth, this wave of climate mobilization is unique in its tactics by using school strikes and ongoing global mass demonstration. This reveals already to the fifth point of uniqueness, as Fridays for Future is a global movement. The last movement that was global was the Occupy movement in 2011. Friday for Future has subgroups worldwide, including environmental activists in Asia and Africa, for instance. The mobilization power of Fridays for Future on a global scale became visible in September 2019, when Fridays for Future was able to mobilize 4 million people in 163 countries. And sixth, Fridays for Future changed the perception of youth. And in the next step, I want to explain why the perception of youth changed and how Fridays for Future contributed to this changing perception of youth. In general, it must be noted that the climate movement that youth shape a climate movement. This is not completely a new phenomenon. Environmental activism has been initiated by young people in the 1970s and 80s, for instance. Also, the fact that youth are part of environmental activism is nothing new. The UN World Climate Conferences regularly invites young people. The youngest girl was 8 years old. However, the average age of Fridays for Future and the high degree of non-electable voters among the protesters is remarkable. The movement is especially characterized by the fact that it is led by young people, predominantly school children and students. The figure shows that the main group of protesters was between 20 and 35 years old, with almost 45%, and 64% are under 35 years. Remarkable is also the number of 90-year-olds, which is almost 20%. The high percentage of youth contradicts the widespreading narrative of an unpolitical youth, which dominated the media and the academic discourse in the last years. In the last years, the youth scholar doubted that the youth is a central age category shaping the future. Youth has been said to have a low level of political interest and are reluctant to engage in politics. Surveys found that youth were less interested in politics and less likely to organize themselves in advocacy organizations. At the beginning of the 21st century, hope was no longer placed in youth as driver of social change. Fridays for Future changed this perception. According to our data, youth have been motivated to demonstrate in order to demonstrate and even to contest that they are unpolitical. The euphoria that there are young people again who are committed to their future has led to the creation of new terms. The current generation of young people going to the streets referred to as generation of Greta, for instance. Youth activists even aim at distancing themselves from the perception of being unpolitical and even from the older age group. A female student described this as follows, and now I'm quoting one of the female protesters which we interviewed. She said, "I have the feeling young people have realized that we have a problem. We are growing up with it. And there are a lot of older people who don't see it as a big problem, who aren't aware of it. Therefore, we are witnessing a new generation of youth who are politically interested in climate issues and who are politically engaged in the climate movement. This generation of youth is shaped by a generational cohesion when you want to describe this cohesion according to Mannheim. Not only being at the same age group, but also their political striving for climate justice constitutes a common bond among the youth. The Fridays for Future Aid group, or the generation Greta, is one which was growing up at a time when the negative consequences of economic growth paradigm were revealed by the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. In addition, young people are faced with multiple crises. They become aware of authoritarian tendencies. They experienced the migrational crisis and even the financial crisis, as already mentioned. At the same time, youth learn about the destruction of the environment at school, and they can feel the changing environment by increasing temperatures, for instance. Youth grow up with the awareness of multiple overlapping crises. And this is what the participants of the strike also confirm, that they feel the suffering from multiple crises. A school pupil who took part in the strike argues that as follows, and now I'm quoting again, "We see that the rainforests are being cut down, the air is getting more and more polluted, biodiversity is declining, but people can't survive without nature. We are part of nature. Yes, I feel the world wouldn't exist much longer. It feels like a threat." Youth grow up with the shared experiences of crisis, in which environmental crisis is the most threatening. They are aware that they have to do something to secure a future worth living in. Fridays for Future are not only young, they are also first-timers. Most protest participants are taking part in the protests for the first time, which is due to the low average age. Interestingly enough, the educational level of Fridays for Future is also high. In September 2019, 59% stated they had a university degree. Accordingly, most of the Fridays for Future, 56% belong to the upper middle class. With this data on education and middle class, Fridays for Future is in line with most of environmental movements since the 70s and 80s. But Fridays for Future are not only young, well-educated, and belong to the middle class, they are also predominantly female. Regarding gender, Fridays for Future was described as a movement driven by women and girls. Women dominate protests with 52%. The high mobilization of young women is remarkable, as protests, particularly demonstrations, are often described as male sphere. The high participation of women is reflected also in the organizational structure of Fridays for Future. Fridays for Future takes gender parity as granted in the mobilization and organization of the movement. Further, reasons why women take part at the demonstrations are manifold. For instance, it seems that young women are increasingly committed to environmental protection. Many of the women link environmental protection with care. To care is an important morality which includes care for the family and care for the nature likewise. This incentive of women to participate at the protest is particularly shared among young mothers. They concern about the future of their children and about humanity as a whole. Here, environmental protection is associated with feminine qualities such as caring and compassion. Another argument why women participate is more emancipatory. One woman expired at the strike or explained that she's participating at the strike due to the double exploitation, the exploitation of nature, which goes along with the oppression of women. Both forms of exploitation are caused by capitalism. Therefore, we are witnessing a welcoming structure of Fridays for Future, which ensures gender parity on the one side and offers a space for women with multiple incentives to be part of the movement at the other side. Now, given the high proportion of women, the question arises, to what extent Greta Thunberg herself influences the participation to protest. Thunberg has been stylized as a leader or icon of the movement. In 2019, she was touring in Europe and the United States, speaking on international stage and conferences, and her actions are being discussed in media. Greta's age, her appearance, her speeches are perceived as unusual, sometimes remarkable, and worth to criticize. The scientific journal Nature named Greta one of the 10 most important people who played a decisive role in science last years. At the same time, Greta is hated, pathologized, and is seen as an extension of eco-corporations. Media described her as an icon or as a brave girl and as a driver for change. But she's also described as driven by hate and power. In the positive iconographic presentation of Greta, she was described as a savior, role model, or as Jeanne d'Arc, who awakens us and saves us. Negative media reports highlight that Greta is angry, combative, idealistic, and emotional. They refer to her illness, and she is denied any competences. Is Greta therefore able to mobilize adherences? According to our survey data, 30% of the protesters state that their personal involvement was influenced by Greta. In this context, women are significantly more influenced by Greta than men. This illustrates that Greta has an influence on mobilization and is definitely a focal point for participants, but that mobilization does not depend on her person. However, it is clearly shown that at a strike in May 2019, when Greta Thunberg was in Vienna, the participation in the protest was significantly higher because of her person. Although Greta has an influence on the participation, the focus on her as a personal icon is contested in the movement, with statements such as, and now I'm quoting an activist in Vienna, "We are all the movement, not only Greta." The activists also try to distance themselves from Greta and her iconization. Greta herself also criticizes the focus on her person and calls herself rather a mouthpiece of sciences. While in the Austrian context, the personification of Greta as a leading figure in the movement is contested, in Germany, Lisa Neubauer is overtaking this positionality and is an important female leader in the movement. Let us turn now to the question whether the young protester, the young female protester, create a generational conflict. Media reports often speak of a generational cleavage between the so-called older and politically active generation and the younger generation. Greta Thunberg's speeches are overloaded with accusations that the older political generation has put the future of the youth at risk. According to the speeches and accusations of Greta, a generational cleavage could be assumed. And also media reports highlight a generational conflict. For instance, Bernd Ulrich argues that the media refer to a generational conflict after the politicians at least denied to respond to the demands of the Fridays for Future activists. And also Simon Hurz warns that the political demands of the young generation should be considered in order to avoid a generational conflict. Does Fridays for Future cause a generational conflict? I would say no, because our data reveal the contrary. Fighting for climate justice does not necessarily lead to a generational conflict, as has been postulated in the media. Fridays for Future argue that age is the determining factor for explaining conflicts, but more important is a certain lifestyle and awareness on environmental issues. The quantitative data reflect common interests between parents and their children, which are engaged in the climate strikes. Almost 77% of the protesters say that their parents are very interested in the issue of climate change, so that climate change can be regarded as a common interest between the parents and the children. Further, 88% of the participants answered that they agree with their parents concerning the reasons for the climate crisis, and 82% concerning who can provide solutions. The data show that the issue of climate crisis is discussed in the families and that the Fridays for Future activists have the support of their parents. The majority might have the support of the parents. The majority of the protests also feel that they are taken seriously by their parents, that they can discuss climate change, and that they have overlapping interests with their parents. And accordingly, young people really rarely criticize their parents and even try to excuse their parents. The parent generation positive reaction to the Fridays for Future movement is appreciated by young activists. So one of the activists says, yeah, the grown-ups really listen. It's really brilliant. Accordingly, several adult groups have been formed in solidarity to Fridays for Future. You might know them. One of them is, for instance, the Parents for Future, the Teachers for Future, the Scientists for Future, the Workers for Future, or the Religions for Future, and there are many others. So Fridays for Future acts in solidarity with many adults. After having pointed out the main characteristics with regard to the socio-demographic data, let us turn now to the political dimension of the Fridays for Future, the attitudes or the political attitudes and expectations of the Fridays for Future. In order to better understand the participants' motives for protesting, it is worth taking a closer look at the protest incentives. The most important incentive of Fridays for Future is to put pressure on the politicians, and this with almost 91%, and also to raise public awareness with about 86%. Especially for young people of non-voting age, protests play an important role because they can express their opinion in the public and also towards politicians. The intergenerational mobilization in the Fridays for Future movement is also reflected here in this table or in this graph, as the third pronounced incentive is solidarity with 85%. The motive expresses the support of the adults who declare their solidarity with the young people in their commitment to climate justice. Let us now look on the relation between Fridays for Future and the politics. For instance, how is the relation to the political parties? The relation of the Fridays for Future to politics and political parties appears relevant from the perspective of social movement research, insofar as parties might be important mediators between the concerns of the movement and the politicians. So, for instance, the politician or the parties might help to implement the demands of the movement. So, who did the Fridays for Future elect? The party preference of the respondents was clearly in the direction of the Greens, with almost 55%. We are witnessing that we are dealing with a movement that sees itself as non-partisan, but whose voters vote for the Greens because of the thematic proximity. Second, we are witnessing a high proportion of protesters who believe that politics can solve environmental problems. During the survey, we asked protest participants who they think is able to solve climate crisis. Each respondent assessed the importance of the economic system, politics, and sciences. The protesters considered the greatest competence and therefore responsibility to be in politics, with almost 80%, stating that the political decision makers are able to solve the climate crisis. In addition, the potential of sciences is also important and said as to be high, while the potential of economy remains low. As seen in the findings of the survey, politics and political decision makers is the most important actor who tries or who is able to solve the climate crisis from the perspective of the Fridays for Future activists. While political decision makers are considered responsible not having sufficiently addressed climate change earlier, they are at the time considered to be the only ones who are able to set regulatory framework for climate change. According to a young adult, an individual can't change that much, but political decision makers have the ability to change the situations on a larger scale. And I want also to quote one of the activists who said especially that it is especially important that politicians do something because the individual can do little to change something. How cheap meat is or how expensive electricity is and so on. These are things that have to come from politics in particular. A further demand for change concerns norms and values from regard of the Fridays for Future activists. Protesters stated that the political decision makers should be transparent and honest. For instance, populism and self-interest should not be allowed to influence politics. The expectation in respect of political decision makers are thus very high and involve a clear demand for a better climate policies. At the same time, there's criticism, for instance, that politicians should listen more closely to the demands of the voters, which means above all that they should keep their promises. In this line, the demonstrators also think that the politicians should act on behalf of the recommendation of scientists, even if the majority of people are opposed. This clearly shows that Fridays for Future stands behind the science. While Fridays for Future realizes that science alone cannot bring about transformation, they believe that transformation should be done by policy which follows or act on behalf of sciences. The slogan of Fridays for Future, "Unite behind the science," should be seen in this slide. Accordingly, you can also perceive Fridays for Future banners during the strike, which say, for instance, and now I'm quoting again, "What the youth tell us, science has been telling us for a long time. We must act immediately. It's not too late now." Friday for Future sees itself as a political movement which interlinks politics and sciences. Because from the perspective of Fridays for Future, scientific findings are not sufficiently taken into account in politics. Fridays for Future therefore acts as a broker between scientists and the political sphere. Fridays for Future not only see themselves as a broker between sciences and politics, but also believes that they can have an influence in politics and hold the government accountable. They are more of the opinion that organized citizens have more influence on politics. And even more than 50% believe that the individual participation is taken into account and can even initiate a certain form of change. This is also reflected in the emotions during the strike. We asked, for instance, which feeling drives the activists? And we are seeing that most dominant feelings during the protests are, for instance, hope, Hope is an important basis for long-term activism, Fridays for Future, and hope is also combined with the belief that their action will go through and that they successfully can impact political decision-making processes. Therefore, Fridays for Future climate protests have mobilized millions of students, young people, and many adults worldwide. The protests contributed to a stronger awareness on climate issues and the climate crisis. They also have shown that mass resistance can have a potential impact on social and political change. The political events of 2019 also suggest that Fridays for Future resistance has indeed been able to achieve some political impact at least. Even if the policy of small steps and fundamental political change have failed to materialize, the engagement of Fridays for Future has contributed significantly to raise public awareness and the political awareness, and to prepare the ground for changes in political decision-making processes, as has been taking place, for instance, in the year 2019 or in the year 2020 with, for instance, the establishment of the Climate Council. In addition, in the election of 2019, the Greens share government responsibility for the first time in history. This can also be seen in relation to the activism of Fridays for Future. And on the European level, the new Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen has explicitly responded to the expectation of the Fridays for Future demonstrations with the Green New Deal. Although Fridays for Future had a certain impact on politics, currently a sense of frustration dominates activism, as the movement fears that the COVID-19 pandemic will displace climate policies and their impact. Well, this onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in February 2020, public attention shifted away from climate issue towards fighting the virus. Fridays for Future feared that the focus on the climate crisis would be lost and that the mobilization power of the movement slows down. Scholars like Donatella de la Porta highlighted the changing restrictive conditions for mobilization during the pandemic. Also, a situation might path the way to activism, and Fridays for Future was confronted with a lot of security requirements and the shift of the focus. Only protesters believe that the climate issue is no longer so strong perceived by media and even in politics. However, for Friday for Future, it was possible to organize a strike again in September 2020 with the slogan "Fight every crisis," and even in the year 2021. Interestingly enough, the protesters were asked about the impact of the pandemic on their decision to participate, and they said that the pandemic had no influence or even no motivating effect on their decision to join the protests. In a further question, demonstrators were asked to express their preference regarding political strategies in combating the health crisis. The largest proportion of people do not want to prioritize either crisis. This opinion that the climate and the pandemic should be treated equally. This shows that Fridays for Future takes the pandemic seriously. Therefore, they are repeatedly called to stand in solidarity in times of pandemic, and also to listen once again to the advices of scientists in dealing with the pandemic. Calls like "we can do it" or "we fight against every crisis" shape activism of Fridays for Future during pandemic. While Fridays for Future is not about denying the legitimacy of any crisis, they want to link overcoming both crises. Fridays for Future does not belong to the pandemic skeptic positions and perceive the interrelatedness of the pandemic and the corona crisis. Therefore, in an alliance of 120 civil society actors, a climate corona deal was created in order to ensure that the state measures are climate friendly and to make it clear that a return to the so-called normality is not desirable. Although the climate corona deal received a lot of media attention when it was published in May 2020, only about 22% of the protesters are aware of the deal. Despite low knowledge of the deal, protest participants agree with the substantive demands of the corona deal and therefore also are in line with the climate corona deal. For Fridays for Future, the pandemic also reveals that the state power to implement uncomfortable measures became clear. Insofar, Fridays for Future still perceive that it is the responsibility and the duty of the politicians to solve the climate crisis in the same way as they solved the pandemic. Fridays for Future had not disappeared or slowed down during the pandemic. Rather, it is a movement in abeyance, as I would call it, according to Greta Thunberg, who established this term of movement in abeyance. Movement in abeyance means that it is a movement which is just on a hold on situation, but which is still able to mobilize. Because the climate crisis has not been solved and Fridays for Future is gearing up to mobilize again. In sum, Fridays for Future established itself as an important civil society actor, overtaking different functions in a society. First, Fridays for Future expresses social discontentment and referred to social lines of conflict in society and politics. In this way, social movement in general and the Fridays for Future movement in particular draw public attention to problems such as the climate crisis. Second, Fridays for Future performs political educational work because it informs and educates citizens on climate issues. Third, Fridays for Future assumes an integrational mobilization function because the movement specifically appeals to citizens to participate in protest and in political decision-making processes. However, this function became criticized as Fridays for Future is driven by middle-class pupils and students and was criticized to be white. Therefore, it is not inclusive enough as most of the critics underline. Fourth, Fridays for Future also acts as a broker between sciences and politics and created important platforms for scientists and politicians to exchange. As a civil society actor, Fridays for Future takes over important interfaces between sciences, society, the media, and politics, and established itself as a new and vital actor of environmental activism. Therefore, Fridays for Future created a new phase in the history of Austrian environmental activism. Fridays for Future successfully sensitized public and put pressure on the political system. Also, Friday for Future still expects more and a more fundamental change and transformation. The movement is young, but a generational conflict cannot be stated. Young people are engaged, but have important alliances which overbridge different age groups and which show something like an intergenerational solidarity. Fridays for Future transformed the perception of youth as an active and important driver for change. With the pandemic, Fridays for Future proves its resilience and also its ability to mobilize under changing conditions, such as during the pandemic. Fridays for Future is therefore flexible and adaptable. We will see what else awaiting us, but it is clear that the pandemic has not displaced the issue of climate justice and that Fridays for Future will continue to mobilize. Thank you very much for your attention.